Welcome to the 15th annual Conference of the Social Sciences. First, I want to thank everyone for being here. And I want to make a couple announcements really quick. I'm going to post the link to the actual conference so you can see the research that's been submitted for the conference. It'll be available in the chat. So if you'd like to go to the conference page after the talk today. But first, this morning in this session, we have Dr. Sewell. Dr. Sewell is an Associate Professor of Sociology at Emory University and the founder and director of the Race and Policing Project, which I hope they will talk about some today so we can find out some more information about that great project. Dr. Sewell is a widely published medical sociologist and social science research methodologist, and we are honored to have them here today to speak to you. Dr. Sewell, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's interesting. I mean, I'm not in Gainesville. I actually was looking forward to coming back to Gainesville because I actually haven't been back since I graduated in some decades ago. But it's good to be here one way or the other. And I'm excited to see where this journey has, I would say I'm reflecting back upon, right, where this journey has taken me, which kind of actually is back to what we were dealing with stuff in University of Florida in the Department of Sociology. I took my first class in deviance in law there and social problems. I'm like, oh, wow, I'm back to thinking about the things I initially thought about some odd years ago. So again, thank you for inviting me in. And I appreciate that you have woken up this great Saturday morning at the crack of almost dawn to think it with me a little bit. So what I'll talk to you about today is a series of studies that I've been doing for, I guess, a while now, that focuses on the relationship between well-being and these gatekeepers of, in this case, is the gatekeepers of the criminal legal system, and who gets to be identified as deserved of surveillance and deserved of violence, as a kind of exposure to violence. I'll start us a little bit from a broader view, which is, if you look into public health literature, if you look at the evolution of how police brutality has been perceived by and treated by public health scholars, about 50 years ago, public health really viewed police as first responders to crime. As first responders to crime, there's a lot of conversations around what is the kind of organizational components of that conversation that's being had between people on the streets and police who have whose primary responsibility is to keep trouble off the streets, to remove the face of that social problem. In the 90s, a psychological model set in, primarily driven from the outside, not by public health scholars, but by social psychologists and a lot of the social sciences, around thinking about policing as an everyday act of assessment of fairness. All right, so there really had already been an idea of policing so much within social psychological literature, but it didn't really differentiate involvement with judges or probation officers from involvement with the police. But it did recognize that any of these contacts with the criminal legal system were stressful. And in the psychological model that came about in the 1990s, we get two different kinds of stress. We get the fact that, yes, these are things that, you don't want to happen because you don't want to face the consequences of being perceived of and labeled as a deviant. But on the other hand, sometimes these things happen and not supposed to, right? So we get yes, it's the burden. And then we also get that it's possibly unfair or is inequitable. In the 21st century, that model of organizational gatekeepers and stress come into a completely different conversation, in the sense of, we are now having a conversation around brutality in its most literal sense, right? And what counts as violence. Until the 21st century, the idea of what was violent in neighborhoods or in urban areas is primarily those who perpetuate crimes. Whereas now we see a trauma model is emerging, where we actually may think the police is part of the perpetuation of that crime, and not just as fanners of the flame, meaning they come in these kind of street level agents and actors, and are making things worse. But they're also literally not necessarily wantonly, but also they are in fact the perpetuator of not just illegal activity, but brutal activity. In this change, 1999, we see the shooting death of Amadou Diallo coming out of his apartment in the Bronx. I don't think he even had a chance to get his hands up. If you hear the story in more detailed, Amadou Diallo, who is an African immigrant, on his way, he has some kind of, I'm going to one day go to school. This is a quote that his mother identifies. He's shot 41 times by the New York Police Department. At that time, people knew the New York Police Department was a little bit wanton. They knew that oftentimes you couldn't even tell who was a police, and they were doing things, these plaincloth police. But there were also these task force that were geared towards rooting out the sources of these types of perpetuators of crime. They did so with very little rules about how they had to do their job. And we see a kind of bellowing up of this process of, I would say, this discontent with that process in the Amadou Diallo situation. It really marks itself as something like what we are seeing now with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so what. It's incensing people. It's also building off of a movement of anti-brutality in sentiments that was really the strongest piece was in New York City. After this period where you're chasing this 21st century, you actually see, I would say, some of the paradoxes of doing this kind of work. On one hand, you actually are seeing a reduction in crime. So that 50 years ago, where people needed the police to come in and save these communities, the need for police was less evident or less perceptibly necessary at that time. And at the same time, there is an increase in this case, we're looking at a study of hospitalizations that only if it had not happened, if the police had not been there, we would not have had these assaults. We would not have seen this person in a hospital. They call this legal intervention related. Here is hospitalizations. We also have the question of homicides, which both George Floyd, Eric Garner are considered as if the police hadn't been there, it would not have happened. This period, we're looking at a different angle of here now. I'm going to show you the legal kind of construction of what we see now as this idea of the era, the fall of stop and frisk. This is New York City Liberal Unity's data, and what you're tracing is a number of stops that are reported by the New York Police Department every year. Around 2003, those stops started to be reported as within a very standardized form, or you would have characteristics of what had happened in a stop, who was stopped, but it was reported by the police after the stop. This stop, question, and frisk data was brought on directly as a result to anti-brutality measures taken after the killing of Amadou Diallo. You can see this is his first red kind of thing here. It's off the charts. It's 1999. In 2000, there was a case brought to the city of New York against the city of New York from Daniels, and Daniels essentially said, you know what, I'm not going to speak for Amadou Diallo, but there are tons of Amadou Diallos here, and we need to know. We think it's illegal, we think it's unconstitutional, but we don't even know the extent of the problem. So what you get is a winning of that case in 2003. You can see here is a second red. And the first year that a full set of things were reported, there was about 100,000. They went retroactively and reported the 2002. So you see that just under 100,000 stops are reported in the first year. We have data on who gets stopped and I would say what happens during the stop. Over the next couple of years, the data set was mandated to be made public. But it was also mandated that there were reports released that about, essentially analyzing whether there was in fact unfair treatment. Those reports were not released. And so there was a second case filed by the plaintiffs, another plaintiff against the city of New York. This is not George Floyd here. This is a different Floyd. And he is one of a couple of defendants named specifically who were, going into their houses, or they were on the street when they got stopped, or they were in the public, I would say, when they got stopped. But the argument here is that, they were targeted, and they were targeted because they were Black. Were Black men, and there were Latino men, in fact, here too. That case did not resolve itself for another 6 years. And during that time, you see this meteoric kind of rise and tops out around 700,000 in 2011. And what happens in the middle of 2011 is the case is actually solved. It says, hey, you're right. You were discriminated against, but I don't think it's systemic. I think, they didn't treat you right. And we recognize they don't really treat people right, but it's not targeted discrimination. Well, the lawsuit is filed again to take up the specific issue of targeted discrimination. And the Supreme Court of New York, of the state of New York, decided to say, okay, we'll take the case. And that's what you see here, this just amazing decline. It was about a 70% decline in reported stops when the New York Police Department says, okay, if you're going to try to police us, we'll just stop policing you. So we call this the slowdown. That case was resolved in August of 2013. So we have a 10-year lag here between court decisions. And in 2013, it was deemed by the Supreme Court of the state of New York that, in fact, the implementation of stop and frisk was unconstitutional, not necessarily because Black and brown people were being targeted as individuals, but because Black and brown neighborhoods were being targeted. And because Black and brown neighborhoods were being targeted, well, of course, that means you're targeting Black and brown people. And the targeting of those neighborhoods was not necessarily idiosyncratic. There was some systematic differences in which neighborhoods got targeted and what. And the way they discovered this was through the data set that was created out of the Amadou Diallo shooting. From that period, you find that not even a year later, Eric Garner is suffocated in Staten Island. So after essentially the success of what I would say the 20 or 30 years of concerted efforts around police brutality, and again, always there, but I do think there's something distinct about this push that we're seeing now. It didn't really, from an on the ground level, it didn't work. People were still being killed. And if you look at the 5 years or so after the that 2013 decision, there are 50,000 stops that are recorded in New York City by the police department. There are essentially less stops recorded after the fall of stop, question, and frisk than the first year that it was ever identified as something we could measure. Neither you believe those numbers or you don't believe them. Either way, it reveals that we have a methodological issue, and we also have a question of what is really the impact of that legacy that happened. And again, we're looking at 10 years here, but really it's far more than that. But at least from the time we have data, what is the impact of that on the communities that were affected? The data that you see here is an aggregation of that data to 34 neighborhoods in New York City. And these are fairly large neighborhoods, but they kind of are very identifiable, whether it's Upper, East Side, or it's, Coney Islands or something like that. And we know if we look at those the averages for those 34 neighborhoods is that there are about 30 stops per 100 people who live in the neighborhood. There are about 54% of those stops involve some type of pat down or frisking, as we call it. About a fifth of those stops involve one of 9 uses of force. Those uses, the indicators of force here are anything from a baton and a taser spray to throwing somebody against the fence, or using your gun as a weapon, not to shoot someone, but to subdue someone physically. I apologize here. We also know that there are racial differences, and I would say really ethno-racial differences in the risk of each of these types of surveillance exposures in the neighborhood. Here we're following the what happens to Black and brown pedestrians in New York City versus white pedestrians. And what we find here is that Black and brown pedestrians are 6 times more likely to be stopped than their white counterparts, that they're 25% more likely to have that pat down than their white counterparts. And then compared to white pedestrians, they're 28% more likely to have force used against them, one of those 9 indicators of use of force. We're going to take this data, and this becomes essentially these, we call them neighborhood effects. Now, they're not neighborhood effects in this causal sense that we think about as effects, but they're effects in the sense of their context in which people grow up. And when we think about these contexts, the context work on one hand to say it happened. So you can see here that there's a number of people are being who are staring back at you. You do see Amadou Diallo here at the bottom. You see Rakia Boyd. You see Oscar Grant. That's out in Oakland, and probably one of the first incidences that was actually videotaped. Right, Amadou Diallo was not videotaped, but Oscar Grant was. And you see some other actors in here that you may or may not know, but you see the full range of people. You see individuals who are white, you see indigenous people, you see women, you see men. But this is the context, for instance, in which this woman, the girl who will become a woman, is exposed to. They know it happens. That woman also, that girl, she's also having her own relationships in space that are shaped by that larger exposure. And most of the time, when we consider the question of police violence, we think about what is it to deal with the most severe aspect of that, which is the lethal aspect, the fatal intervention deaths, or the fatal encounters or the legal intervention deaths. And we don't necessarily focus on either the girl who is in this space, or these other more what I would say everyday acts of aggressions that are happening in the on the street. So I kind of thought about this in kind of 6 different ways in which we can think about that everyday act of stopping to what we would see as a form of stress that has been acknowledged in the literature. And I would say the 2 parts that have really been acknowledged is what I mentioned before is everyday stressors, as well as that you're growing up in this area that creates we call it a climate of fear, or these ecological stressors. The one though I like the most, however, is that if you grow up in these kind of areas, or if you are exposed to this level of violence on an everyday basis, you start to, understand this thing as a kind of some other people are distressed, not necessarily that you are. So in this case, the people who live in these samples, these neighborhoods, these residents who we're going to track their health, their observers to distress. And what we know from the psychophysiological literature is that when someone around you is distressed, that it also activates your own stress response. So if you hear a baby cry, or you hear someone screaming down an alley, you start to precipitate more. There's more brain activity. You start to think about what is going on. You change your body. You're shifting. You're under discomfort. Those are things that affect someone, and you can't really control it. They're almost an automatic reaction to these issues, except if you live in an area where this happens all the time. That automatic aspect of that is kind of encoded into the body in the ways that are very difficult to trace. Primarily because by the time you see the person, it's fairly endemic to who the way in which they're kind of coping with and responding to stress, which is kind of the next 2 things. One, you kind of think it will happen not just in your neighborhood and you're living in a place where everybody kind of deals with these issues, but you yourself are, it could happen if you go out on the street today, or you go get a carton of milk or whatever else it is, and you develop not just this question of hypervigilance where you're kind of always worked up and thinking about how to avoid those areas. You either avoid the block or the alley where the police may be, or you develop these kind of negative coping mechanisms where it's either food intake issues or kind of other kind of behavioral health things that are on themselves not very good for your body. But they're kind of the best way for you to, I call it like I stress eat. So it's stuff like that where you're kind of trying to figure out with your physical behaviors how to deal with the things that really are your body and your mind are taking internally. The other two are probably really what I would say fit within the psychological model that came about in the 1990s. Either these kind of constant aspects of your stress being activated and you're coping with it. It actually jumpstarts a biological process of aging. That in between there is a good bout of literature on allostatic load, and that essentially, if you're always in fight or flight mode, then eventually your body just stops. It doesn't have the capacity to do more fighting and more more fighting and more flighting, which is the idea of you start to weather faster. And then lastly, as we know that again, if you see these things as they shouldn't be happening, it's an indicator of injustice. It's, I'm being discriminated against from any number of social statuses, that this just perceiving, just understanding that you're experiencing on the ground interpersonal discrimination and unfair treatment itself is a stressor, and it's been linked both to psychological and physical well-being. The first set of relationships I'll show you capture the idea that maybe if there's this woman, this girl who becomes a woman who goes to the doctor's office. There's about 10 blocks, which is a city mile to the doctor's office. On if there's an additional 1 block, so if it goes from 54% to 63% of the blocks, that's from 5 blocks to 6 blocks, or if it goes from I would say 2 blocks of use of force to 3 blocks of use of force, that's that standard deviation increase of 9 percentage points in the prevalence of frisking or use of force in a neighborhood. That there's a greater chance that when a doctor opens up that file, that they're going to have poor fair health. There's a increased risk that they're going to have diabetes, a 17% increase in the risk that that doctor will say, yes, that person has high blood pressure, hypertension, that, there's evidence they've reported some kind of asthma attack or asthma episode complication within the last year. And that, when they get on the scale, which is about the first thing they do when you go to the doctor's office, that they are coming in body mass index is indicating that they're either overweight or obese. All of these things that you can see here, particularly the last 4, are things that are implicated in, most of our causes of mortality, or, we're seeing now these vulnerable conditions that lead someone to be more exposed to the adverse and serious effects of COVID-19. We also know that there is a psychological component of this, in that individuals who are in these not just high risk neighborhoods, but also neighborhoods where there's more use of force. Again, we're talking about that extra block. There's an increase in nervousness and hopelessness and worthlessness. And there's also an indicator that, over the last month, you were experiencing some signs of clinical mental health problems, or things that you really would probably need to go see a doctor on. And the impact of, or the risk, the association of that extra block of use of force is actually a little bit stronger than that of the extra block of frisking. But you can kind of see here that these are pretty high numbers as far as substantive effects. If we were looking at a public health intervention, anything more than 10% of a change due to an intervention, which in this case, the intervention is exposure to police violence or exposure to neighborhoods where there is police violence. We would want broad spectrum policy to make that go away, to diminish its effects. So we're seeing here something that's pretty robust. We also know that within these neighborhoods where that extra block of in this case, use of force happens, there is higher levels among men of clinical psychological distress. There's a 21% increase compared to women in those same neighborhoods. That in fact, yes, that person is experiencing some form of psychological stress. 30% increase in nervousness, 18% increase in worthlessness and effortfulness. I think about this fairly concretely. So here we're not talking about the woman who's walking 10 blocks, but the fact that, there's a boy that maybe that woman has a son that, they've been in that same environment. They're kind of dealing with some of the same exposures or stimuli. And oftentimes it might be that when they get up to go to school, and again, might be 10 blocks away, they may or may not personally have been stopped, that when they go through the metal detector, they don't really feel very comfortable. They're shifting, they look nervous. And when they're trying to kind of figure out, how to solve that math problem, it's not that they don't know how to resolve the functions, but it takes a lot of effort. And at the end of the day, they come out of school and they don't feel like they're worth much, that they're not really don't fit in, and not just that other people don't value them, that maybe they're just not valuable at all to society. So we see these kind of pattern responses. We also know that within these neighborhoods, here you're going to see a collection of things. It's not the same thing for each of these racial groups, but remember, you have to be in the same neighborhood to make some of these assessments. So you're looking at Blacks, Latinos, and Asian Pacific Islanders who live in the same neighborhood. If you compare them to whites, that Blacks and Latinos tend to have a higher risk of high blood pressure, again, different types of neighborhood factors. But the part that I actually think is really interesting about this class is that of Asian Pacific Islanders, who are both less likely to be stopped by the police than any group, but they also tend to have the better health outcomes, particularly this question of self-rated health, which is for us a prime indicator of early mortality. If Asian Pacific Islanders live in these areas where there's more racial differences in use of force, meaning where Black and brown people are more likely than their white counterparts than to experience use of force, that number does not even consider Asians in its comparison as far as exposure, but it does consider it in regarding of what kind of thing it has associated with for individuals. And when you look at that, there we start to have a more palpable conversation around really what is the latitude, the I would say the appropriateness of these types of behaviors, these types of surveillance structures, because individuals who have nothing to do with being stopped and really have no problems in coming in there, and this is theoretical at some point in time, they're also more likely to be affected by the disparity in the marginalization of individuals based off of whether they essentially fit the description. The last set of slides here, I'll think about it a little bit differently. But when you want to think about that use of force measure, and here we're just looking at where there's more use of force, that extra block, you see that the impact or the risk that is associated with living in a predominantly African American and Latino community. This is going to the right of this screen. So going to right here for each of these x-axes, you have more minorities in those areas. The impact of living in those areas and kind of returning back to you these health problems is stronger if those neighborhoods have higher levels of use of force. And here I'm not having any conversation about causality from an individual perspective, but I am thinking about the question of context and the risk factors at the ecological and distal level that places that vulnerability for these underlying conditions. On the other hand, if you look at racial differences in use of force in these neighborhoods, so that would be that increase in, I would say, 28% of having use of force among Black and brown people than among whites. You actually see that it is predominantly white communities, as these are the communities over to the left here that have the highest rate of illness that's associated with living in these disparate, inequitably surveilled neighborhoods. And so what you're seeing here, if you follow the solid line, these are areas where minorities are 69% more likely to have force used against them by police. Those areas in each of these graphs, mostly, they have some of the highest rates of illness. So you're actually here comparing two neighborhoods where they're predominantly white, and in the areas where Black and brown people are treated inequitably, the people in the neighborhood, which are predominantly white, are experiencing that consequence. And there isn't a racial differences within the neighborhood of who is carrying that effect. So it's a broad spectrum. So not only do we have people who are less likely to be stopped by the police and have better health are being affected, but people who, we don't even really think about as part of the conversation around inequitable policing, they're also affected. We can think about high blood pressure, obesity, diabetes. And one of the interesting things about this is that the neighborhoods in here they have the least amount of use of force disparities, this just equality. There actually are no places in New York City, at least, where minorities are less likely to be have force used against them than whites, which tells you a lot of tells you a lot about the overall and overarching problem. The last study I'll talk about, actually not the last study, is second to last study, is about the fact that if you live in these areas where these, for instance, these legal intervention assaults actually are fatal. So we're looking at homicides that are due to injuries inflicted by police or other law enforcement agents in the course of arresting or attempting to arrest and other legal action. So this is not just, you know, injury by police themselves. This is when you're actually trying to enforce the law. So when security agents are trying to enforce the law, we see a range of CVD risk for individuals who live in such neighborhoods. And when we're capturing this question of lethal surveillance at the neighborhood level, we're talking about within the 10 years prior to the fall of Stop, Question, Frisk, you saw that there were at least 3 legal intervention deaths. Now, if you actually compare this numbers, this is a vital statistics for the city of New York. If you compare that to a publicly available data set on police killings, mapping violence, fatal encounters, it's gone through different names, but it's about the same thing. There is actually more within this period, that 10-year period, there are more stops. There are more police killings that are documented in some of the areas where these lethal surveillance indicators are the highest. So there essentially are more victims than I would say, but if you have 3 or more, you're in this pool. Individuals, if you compare individuals who live in neighborhoods where there's 3 or more legal intervention deaths to those who are not in those areas, there's a higher risk of blood pressure and obesity. If you just look at all women in New York City and you compare those who live in that area where there's at least 3 police killings in the 10 years prior to New York Stop and Frisk becoming unconstitutional, there's a greater risk of obesity. But when you look in those same neighborhoods and you compare women and men in those neighborhoods, women have a greater risk of the CVD trifecta. These are the leading causes of a heart attack, essentially. They're diabetes, high blood pressure, and obesity. So we don't get the same story that we saw with psychological distress, but it's a distressful story, not either way, where you're seeing that individuals who are overexposed, I would say, to surveillance, and I think we do have to have a conversation specifically about violence, police violence, just like we have interpersonal violence or intimate partner violence, we have police violence. As is thinking about the violence as being unique to and targeted around the person who's doing the environment and the source, the personal physical source of the violence, which in this case would be the police. I feel like that's not the last one. I'm missing a slide here. But I wanted, before we get too far into this one, there's another study that I did in Philadelphia, where if you look at that the same frisking conversation, individuals who live in neighborhoods where there's more frisking, and this is a different city, and they really don't have very good health, right? So they have poor, fair, self-rated health. Those individuals actually are less likely to go to the emergency room. So that same woman who has all these problems, and they're, that the doctor has identified, when they actually do have a hypertensive episode or a diabetic episode, they're less likely to try to go get help, which of course we know is linked to pretty bad conditions. So I'll think about it in a different way, I would say a more conceptual way. We're talking about the question of place, which one of the ways in which we predominantly consider race is these issue of segregation in both people of different ethnic and racial backgrounds, as well as economic backgrounds. And this is always occurring in conversation with who is looking at and controlling and identifying who shouldn't even be in those spaces and who actually should be in those spaces. So this larger politics of surveillance, each of those things have their own conversations with well-being, but also that then places us in a kind of a push-pull. a tug of war between those who are essentially fighting back or who are contesting the surveillance systems that are placed on them. And that itself has its own kind of feedback. And so if we look at this, I say the term, and sometimes I look at it and say, maybe it's a little too much to say that, but I think policing is the blood of America. And you can move those articles around however you want to. America, the blood of policing, blood is policing America. You can come up with many different combinations of those words, but they all kind of have the way in which they hit you has nothing really to do with the sentence itself. It has to do with the emotional content and the ways in which you relate to each of those things, the broader society of the United States, the question of surveillance, whether it's the police or it's the doctors or it's teachers and so on and so forth, or is your HR boss, they're all different types of forms of surveillance. And the end of this, in the middle of this, is the question of life and death. And, we may not want to be dramatic about it, except that as you've seen, we have these lethal forms, we have non-fatal forms, we have very serious forms of violence that are happening. As a way to think about this concretely, I want to talk about this idea of what's happened really in the last year. Here you're looking at George Floyd Square, which on the top right of that corner is the store that was perceived as the place that he was doing something he wasn't supposed to do. That happened. He was surveilled. He was choked to death at the end of May. And this happens within a broader conversation around the pandemic. And in fact, when he died, he still had evidence of COVID-19 in his body. He had been diagnosed as infected earlier in May, and he had been laid off from his job because he was considered, he was a non-essential worker. So we see this kind of space, and what you're looking at in George Floyd Square, it was a place of vigilant protest. There was no violence here for the whole time that we've been in this space. And there's this area is going to be dedicated to a memorial for him later on. Well, George Floyd Square is at the 38th Street and Chicago Avenue intersection. And that area is about 10 blocks north, I'm not making this up, but 10 blocks north of the corner of a red line neighborhood. So George Floyd Square is redlined, and George Floyd was redlined. And when you look at this block, we're looking at here on the red square, we're going to look just at this block here. This is 47th and Chicago. Chicago is going north and south. 47th is going east and west. If we take over here, this unit, this parcel, it's right at that corner. This is a unit that had a racially restrictive covenant on it that was established in the late 1900s, and it was in effect until 1925. The racial covenant reads, "It is further stipulated and agreed by and between the parties heretofore themselves, their heirs and assigns," meaning anyone related to you, or anyone you want to be a protector of the property, as part of the consideration hereof, that the within described premises shall not be sold, mortgaged, or leased to, or occupied by any person or persons other than members of the Caucasian race. This is 100 years ago, right? And it's not that we don't have to have a causal story about it, but if you look at this entire block, there are racially restrictive covenants on each of these homes. And it's not just these homes, but it's the homes on the other side, right, that are going to be further into the block. And that entire area, if you even right now, you can see that area has more people who are Caucasian in ancestry than those who are not. And Minneapolis is actually a very diverse place. We're looking at South Minneapolis right now. But what we're seeing here is that the block that the unrest is kind of built around, that block itself is part of the microcosm that I was mentioning to you before. And we can see the red line starts not just to the east of that block, but it's part of the north. And if you go down those 10 blocks, you're going to see that historically that is an area that has been disinvested. So when I think about what does it take for the question of police violence to be in consideration of segregation and mobilization, it's not that again I'm saying one is the other or one causes the other, but we can't have a conversation about what it takes to move out of these things without understanding the salience of one space, one thing that happens across time. And I'll leave you with this. This is a 2001 song by Nas. If you are a hip hop fan, you may know his name. It's called One Mic, and he goes through this, and he says, you know, all I need is one life, one try, one breath. I'm one man. I want you to see me essentially as one person that's deserving of respect. And he says, you know, if I could just have one way to talk about this, and for him it's the block, and what I would argue here is that all you really need to divvy up or to put on the ledger of segregation and supremacy is you just need one block. He, in this case, he says, I just need one chance, one mic to spread my voice to the whole world. And in this case, George Floyd didn't get that. And in this case, you see in the picture, there are, you know, what I would probably say some iconic understandings of urban environment where you have young Black men who are running towards a mic, and you have right above Nas's shoulder a cop who is pursuing them. And in this song, these individuals are sitting there in a car and not really doing anything, but they're surveilled. They're chosen as we need to make sure, in fact, that you do belong here. So I'll end there, and we can open it up for discussion. I again appreciate that you have all come here and give me the space to think with me a little bit. So the question is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected your research direction? You know, the pandemic is actually, I don't think it actually changed the direction. It definitely changed the interest in the work. But as you can see, the outcomes, the well-being risk factors, and the well-being outcomes are things that are directly relevant to the COVID-19. The leading indicators of hospitalization and death is high blood pressure, or cardiovascular disease, chronic pulmonary disease, diabetes. There's some other ones in there. Obesity is a big indicator. And so we're not really looking at things that unfortunately are very distinguished from each other. But we're also, you know, faced with the fact that these are not outcomes per se, but they're indicators. They're, I would say, they're a reflection of these vulnerable conditions. I would say you might, you know, from, you know, where's the direction? I would say that police violence is a vulnerable condition that places one at risk for when there is a problem, our ability to solve the problem, as well as the extent to which that problem is exacerbated by these policy conditions. I would say one way, I would say, if you think about COVID-19, I mean, if you are interested in causal analysis, you have a perfect quasi-experimental design. This time last year, COVID-19 wasn't really a conversation. I think we hadn't even closed the borders yet. And now you have a completely different society. You have 500,000 people who have died. A good chunk of those individuals, at least a disproportionate number of those individuals, are Black and brown people. And that has not abated. And I would say has become more stark as we have gone on. So the question is, it seems like you look at gender and racialized police violence. How could including intersectional identities play a role in your research? I'm assuming that you mean other types of intersectional identities. The ones I think would be really interesting to look at are age. We don't think about age so much as an intersectional identity, but it is. The reality is the questions of ageism cut both ways, right? You have individuals who are racialized who from the age of 9 are perceived as if they're 16, and when they're 12 they're perceived as if they're 25, and that's not just men but that's also young girls, and being perceived as an adult they get the penalties of being an adult. So I would assume that the impact of these exposures are going to be probably stronger for that age. And I think if I remember from the earlier studies, we did an age cut where the effects were stronger. You also, on the other hand, have, if we think about this question of the pandemic, you have an older population that's also overexposed to the risk factors. So you're not going. I don't think it's going to be a linear relationship. Right? I think not just the context of violence and its meaningfulness for young people is going to be stronger, but the impact and the ways in which that same set of risk factors creates complex questions of social isolation, right? You lose friends. You are scared to talk to your neighbors, and maybe that's okay now in the COVID era, but not so much really for your social well-being. You also have the question, I would say, of sexuality, and I think that's very, very important. If you look at some of the early anti-brutality strategies, a lot of them were spearheaded by street youth, which a number of those street youth are queer, they're trans, they're gender nonconforming, they're gender expansive. And there's a study that was done in 2010 that asked the question, have you ever recorded excessive use of force by the police with your mobile phone? And what at least I found, it was fielded by Juan Battle and other scholars within gender and sexuality studies. And I retested the question on 2 national surveys. We have a fourth one going into the field. And each of those surveys said 2 things. One, if you experience those things and you have prior contact with the criminal legal system, it can be anything from being arrested to being detained, from getting a ticket, from having a felony. If you engage in those acts of digital surveillance, mobilization, you actually have better health. So there is a way to move beyond this. And I would say, coping, I don't like the word coping here. I would rather use the word protest and political efficacy and civic participation. That there is a way to kind of essentially reclaim some of the life that has been taken from you. But it's also, if you look in these data sets, it's the most disenfranchised people who are likely to engage in that. Queer people, people of color, men, individuals who don't have voter ID cards, people who are not registered to vote, people who can't vote. Okay, so it's the individuals who are, think about this this is not a concrete situation here, but the people who are showing you the most inequitable worlds, they're the ones who actually cannot be a part of that world that they're asking us to create. And a lot of that conversation, when we look at even earlier aspects of thinking the organizational model, we understand a lot of this through the lens of queer people without understanding that that's the lens we're looking at, right? And I always ask, like, why would you ask a question like that? And I asked the PIs, they said, well, this is what organizers on the street said. It was the only form of accountability that was there. And now this form of accountability is everywhere. And we actually don't even understand that it comes from a place of hyper marginalization. So I think that's something that if we were to look at it more closely, we would see some disparities, not just in how people are being affected within these areas, but also the general way in which we approach mobilizing against the police. Hi, Tanya. Okay, I'll just read it. It sounds like your research brings together a collection of interesting and valuable data. Could you please comment on this process? How accessible are these data? How does one get access? Are these data that you would like to get or use that are more challenging? and essentially what kind of data collection could help to improve research on these topics. So all the data that I'm using are publicly available. Um, all of them, actually. New York City, one of the best places to get data if you're interested in doing neighborhood and ecology stuff, as well as Philadelphia. You can get them through open data. Philadelphia data you can get through open data sites, and then New York City you can go and download it from their city government. You can download the NYPD Stop and Frisk database from the NYPD, and the health data for New York City is also publicly available. For Philadelphia, that data is not publicly available. It's a consortium. If you talk to Temple University, they'll help you get it, but you have to ask for it. And so, what is not so you ask, and it's a good question. Um, are there data that you would like to get or use that are more challenging? It's harder to get these data across places. So listen, if there are 3,000 counties in the United States, there are at least 3,000 different police forces, which means there are 3,000 different ways to collect data. So the question of systematicity is directly a problem or a challenge to measurement, because you have different forms of measurement. You don't know if it's real or if it's artificial. So that's something I think that a federal initiative would be able to do a better job of. But with all of that said, you have to know where these things are happening. The fatal encounters data is a good data set, and it has a lot of demographic information that you don't have in some of the other data sets. I'm thinking about the vital statistics for New York City, but at the same time, you don't necessarily have this question of a particularity that you would need to look at the local area. So we just don't have enough of that data. We don't really have a lot of that data outside of these large cities at all. And the last thing I think, which you would really need to improve, you need longitudinal data. Unfortunately, I do not want to randomly assign systemic racism or police violence, but I think if you were to identify people across time, if you were to follow them, you can get at some of these quasi-experimental design effects that, for instance, something like the pandemic would offer. What I'm trying to say is that there's probably people on the ground right now that have a view of these things, but if they looked at their data differently as things that could be archived, not just described, but they can be archived in different ways. I think we can use that to pull together something that's more informative than just looking at one of these things points in time. How did you decide your direction in academia after leaving UF? I didn't come to Florida to be a sociologist. It's just not what I was going to do. I wanted to be an engineer. I came to University of Florida to study material science and engineering, and then the first 3 weeks I was here, 9/11 happened, and it changed everything. It changed my understanding of what was important. I'm in here with my little lab coat making soaps, and it just didn't make any sense anymore. So I decided to go down this route of looking through research through the social lens. And I had only one goal when I went to the University of Florida, which was to get into graduate school. I had no idea what I would do once I was there. And so what happens after I left Florida was I started to think about, what does it take to do research really that nobody would really fund? I mean, this is not stuff that people would fund, definitely at the time that I was doing it. And I think even now, people kind of, no one wants to, the government doesn't want to fund it to stunt political participation anymore. So what it means is that you have to raise your own sources of support, and it's just different. So I did come into understanding that if I was going to stay in academia, I'd have to do it my way. And that puts us in some pressure points where there's not a lot of places you can go do it your way. And it was just something I think I decided not to follow so much the question of the topic, but the methods. And that was something that that was taught to me. It was impressed upon me in graduate school. I did not get that earlier, but there was also a point of time, I think when I was in graduate school, we got elected our first Black president. So no longer could I say it's not about race. No longer could I say it's not about, no, you don't, if you're studying issues of inequality, you have to speak to the things that are happening around you. You can't live in a not just a bubble. I think a bubble is kind of patronizing to say that, but to live in a place where you don't think the things you're doing are relevant. Everything you're doing is relevant. And that is something that changed after I left Florida. I started to think a little bit more strategically about policy issues, about how people would use the data, and what are the practical aspects of the data. And not to say I have all that figured out, but that is something that did change as far as what does it mean to stay in academia as someone, you know, who isn't necessarily studying anymore, but actually part of the construction of knowledge. Um, so here's, I'm a Black student who does race work at UF. How do you handle the inquiries about the personal stake that you have in your research, and that it somehow weakens research to have emotions about it? Oh, if you look too far into my CV, you'll find I did an honors thesis on the experience and expression of emotions of anger among Black workers in the South. So I just went right at it. I'm not gonna lie, I was a very angry kid. It didn't make nothing made sense. They told me that there was freedom and democracy and equity. And when I got into it, it just didn't look like that. And so I said, you know what, I'm going to study it. I made that decision, and it's not a decision I regret. I needed to make that decision to make sense of things systematically. I wanted to use a scientific method to come to a better understanding. So I think you should use science to make sense of the things you don't know about. And if some of the things you don't know about are things that are very close to you, that's okay. The problem with the term personal stake is that everything is personal in science. No one comes into this place as if they're an object on the wall. Even if you're on the wall, you're on someone's wall. You're not on a wall that's out there, you know, in floating inside of a galaxy that doesn't have a middle or a core to it. Everything, every time we ask a question, we're asking that from a place of our own knowledge. But what's not appreciated when you do research on race is that everybody's knowledge is subjective. And so what the number one thing people tell you to do is, well, it's just opinion. And I'm okay with you saying that. And then I'll just keep doing the work. I think it's more important to do the work than to try to justify doing the work to other individuals. When I think about questions of justification, those questions are things I think about to the people who can do stuff with my work, as in policymakers or interventionists or teachers, right? Or music counselors, people who are trying to change people's lives. That's the opinions that I'm interested in, less about the opinions of people within the sciences. I will say that if you're interested in your stakeholders or science, you need to learn how to speak the language of science. And that is something that I think if you are um, not encouraged, it's harder, I would say, to be motivated to learn the science, the language of people who don't really respect you, you know, and people who don't think you're valuable. Remember, I was saying about the nervousness and the effortfulness and the worthlessness that in this case it was a boy, but it could be a girl. And in fact, if you look at just the basic associations, it was everybody was experiencing this. This is just the gender differences and the risk of these factors culminating. But what I'm getting at here is that the only way to really solve the problems of subjectivity is to be successful. And you can't be successful if you don't learn the rules. And you can't let people, you're not going to learn the rules if people take you out the game. So I'm okay with people asking me, you know, is this personal? Actually, it is. You know, I grew up in a neighborhood that was redline. I grew up in a neighborhood where the foreclosure rates before the recession were higher than that of the city of Detroit, which we all know went through a foreclosure at the public. I think that matters. You know why? Because that's my wall. My wall is a red line neighborhood. My wall is a place that experienced subprime foreclosure crisis. I look at things differently because my wall is different, and I think that offers something for us to consider. It doesn't take away from those things. As a social science scholar, what advice would you give to young scholars who are just entering academia? So the advice that someone gave to me, and I like to give this to everybody else. I think it's good to get it early. Is you can't wait until you're ready. People often come into academia and say, "Well, I'll do what I want to do something, but I need my degree first. Oh, I want to do something, but I haven't read enough. I want to do, but I don't know how to do it." And it's true, but you have to do it anyway, right? You can't wait until you've gotten tenure. You can't wait until you've gotten a job. You can't wait until you finish your postdoc, because if you keep waiting, it can become itself a structure of understanding things, right? So you have to do it even though you don't know how to do it. And if you're doing it at the same time you're learning how to do it, you're getting real practical life advice on how to do it better. Instead of, what, I now have all the tools. Let me start to plan the strategy, to plan the event. And I think it's as a young scholar, we're by saying that we'll wait until to do something, we're actually putting our brain on pause when we do that. We're saying, I'm not going to think about this until I think I'm ready for it. So the first thing you spend so many time trying to decide, are you ready for it? And not enough time, or the same amount of time. Well, how do you solve the problem, right? An example I'll give to that is the Race and Policing Project. It's not a direct example, but when I started graduate school, I had been involved in the performance scene for a while at that time. I was a very poor public speaker before I found that maybe if I speak poetry, I don't sound so bad. So I had been performing around the country as a spoken word artist, a slam poet. And I had realized, you know what, listen, I ain't the best poet. I won maybe one slam, placed in a couple. Well, I'm not going to make a living off of this thing. But there was something that happens in these in areas where you're able to tell stories. You're able to collect these experiences. And I wanted to give that back to people, but I didn't know how to. So first of all, I had to learn how to write. Right? I had to learn how to write as a scientist, not just as a poet. But I also knew that the end goal was to kind of create this space where people could share information and benefit from science from it, right? We all have stories to tell, and science is just another way to tell the stories with a different type of methodological support system for it. When you take all of that into to consideration at the age of 22, I didn't know how to do any of that stuff, but I put it in my intention that I wanted to do it, and I kept trying to figure out, well, can I do it by starting this associate? We started, there was all the craziness with the election, and people were very upset, and everyone felt like they can now I can tell you just how bad things have been. So students are far more radical than our teachers, and we wanted to do something. We wanted to create a space for ourselves at Indiana University. So we created a space for ourselves. And 7 years later, that became the Center for Research on Race, Ethnicity, and Society. It's still in existence. All right. It started as this one little group in sociology of how discontent we were with not being socialized and professionalized. It started in my third year in graduate school. By the time I finished, we had a center. Now they have postdocs, people get jobs, and so on and so forth. It persists. And I say this as an example for the Race and Policing Project. I came out into starting, honestly, I graduated in 2013. A year later, people are writing Ferguson movement. And all I can think was, I wasn't trained for this. I was not trained to talk about protests and the impact of this stuff. But I can't say I'm at the protest, like, what, something's wrong, And I started to do the work on policing. I developed a methods for understanding neighborhood effects, which was a big thing of an analysis at that point in time. How do you pull apart the environment from the individuals in the environment, and you're using the same source of data to understand the environment and the individual? Well, you can't do that. You have to find an external source of data. So at least you've taken away the error that is unique to individuals in constructing what we think is the environment. And that's this. A lot of what I do is you're merging together different types of data, sources of data, to get at this kind of embedded relationship. Well, it's 2014, and there's these young people who were very upset. And I'm like, man, if I could do the same thing I did for my dissertation, but hey, let's study the criminal justice system, where everybody at that time is studying incarceration. And I'm like, interested in incarceration, but I'm actually interested in what's that first line of defense? It's police. But there was no data sets that I knew about. But someone then said, hey, there's a data set. And I'll end this story by saying that within 2 years, I published the first set of studies on police violence and health. And everybody was still upset. I hadn't solved any problems. Nobody knew anything more, but people wanted to know. So we started crowdsourcing stuff. We started using each other as our own source of data. It's really working in the same veins of what I wanted to do as a 22-year-old, but I had a different set of tools to do it at 10 years later or so. And we got a cease and desist letter. We were crowdsourcing all this material. We got a cease and desist letter. Hey, man, you shouldn't be able to do this. You're breaking copyright. I don't know what copyright laws. I don't know anything. I'm just a kid. I don't come from places where people know these things. So how am I supposed to learn? A cease and desist letter will teach you a lot. So I had to get on the ground and think about how to preserve this body of knowledge. And I created the Race and Policing Project. At the same time, I don't know what the Race and Policing Project is. For me, it was just a website where I can post some crowdsourced material behind the password. And you had to ask for it now. It wasn't just out there, but it was still there. Now I learned, repository, curator, this. And that was 5 years ago. Now, if I had said, wait a minute, I need to wait until I'm ready to do something like that, none of this conversation would be happening. And so my advice for young scholars is just to do it and allow yourself to be comfortable with failing, to get those cease and desist letters, to do something and feel completely ineffective and invalidated, and not to leave because of that, not to stop because of that, but to use that. Well, we know we can do that. We know we want to do this. We know now we can do this. And wait a minute, we know we can't do that. Use that to create your own pathway to doing what you want to do, versus, what you did, you planned, you studied, and now you're ready to do it. But the reality in real life, the rules of engagement change every day. Every 4 years, the rules of engagement. Every 2 years, the rules of engagement change. Every day that you become a different age, the rules of engagement change. And so if you're always preparing for when you get there, by the time you get there, the rules have changed and you haven't prepared for that yet. So I would say, just do it and allow yourself to be okay with not having done it right. Where do you draw the line between personal passion and professional interest when doing academic work? Um, for me, there actually is a very clear line. When the personal passion is, there's too much to lose. So my short answer to that is, when I came into academia and I wanted to, I said, okay, I'm gonna go to this grad school, do this thing. I really actually was closer to doing work in women's studies and gender and sexuality studies. But when I got to Bloomington, which was one of the best places to live as a queer person, and we didn't really use that term then, but it catches all of us. It was not a safe place to live as a Black person. And as a Black person who is hyper marginalized around gender and questions of sexuality, it's a really unsafe place to live. And a lot of people who were in the same social condition, they never made it out. They were kicked out, they dropped out, they just disappeared into other parts of the university. And I wasn't willing to put that object of inquiry up for professional interest. I didn't feel like I had the support, and it was my community. And so I said, well, listen, I want to know this stuff. I want to learn this stuff, but I don't have anyone that I trust to teach me. And I'm not also willing for someone else to tell me what is my community and what is going on. That is 15 years ago. And last year, I started a national LGBTQ women survey. I wish I could have started that 15 years ago, but I didn't have the support. So my professional interests changed. I wanted to come in and talk about spoken word communities and these kind of their guerrilla communities, but I didn't have the support for it. And so that was, I had to put my personal passions down and pick up something that frankly was more sanitized, something that was more accessible, and something that other people could care about as well. People now care about the stuff that people didn't care about 15 years ago. There's more support for it. The idea of funding itself is far more diverse, and you can have more sources of people who say, like a Russell Sage that says, hey, we'll invest in you. Well, there are many different types of Russell Sages now for people who were working in these more hyper marginalized communities. And I just wasn't willing to put that up for discussion at that point in time. Not to say it wasn't important, but I didn't feel like I had the support. That for me is the line. If I don't feel like I can be supported in a professional environment on some things, I'm not gonna put that out there for an object of inquiry. But I will, as I said to you, I will plot and plan and maybe dream. I can't even say plot and plan, but because it literally sometimes I just, we're not going to deal with it. But I developed all kinds of other strategies along the way that now I can then apply back to these issues that I was personally passionate about, and that did drive me into academia.
Okay, I guess that was the last question. First, I want to thank Dr. Sewell for coming and joining us today. A lot of great information, and I really enjoyed your answers to some of the questions as a graduate student, learning about your direction and all the great work that you're doing. So thank you very much for coming and talking with us today. I also would like to take the opportunity to thank our executive committee from the Florida Society of the Social Sciences and the UF Student Government for funding this event. And I would also like to say thank you to Beth Head for the technical support during this event. And I hope to see everyone at our next event at 10:30. That will be with Dr. Russell Brown. And thanks again for all the great questions and all the great submissions and work. And we hope to see everyone next year and at the next event as well at 10:30. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Sewell.
All right. Take care. Bye.